Blindsight refers to the unconscious detection of features that are not consciously perceived because of damage to the visual cortex, according to the Encyclopedia of Perception written by Goldstein. Blindsight was first reported by Larry Weisskranz, let's just call him Dr. Larry, in 1977. His evidence came from a man who underwent surgery to remove a tumor from his primary visual cortex, leaving the man blind in the contralateral visual field of the affected hemisphere. We know that the primary visual cortex is the entry point for the information received from the eye and is located in the back of the brain. The right side of the primary visual cortex receives information from the left visual field, and the left primary visual cortex receives information from the right visual field. The patient Dr. Larry was studying lost his right visual cortex abilities, rendering his left visual field blind. So, because he could move his eyes to adjust the bad visual field, the tests were done with a quick stimulus to the bad field. When presented with a light or different orientation of lines, the patient felt as though he was guessing at answers. Consciously, he saw nothing. But how is it that all his answers were right if he could not see? Dr. Larry called this unique and strange condition blindsight. Many arguments rose up to fight against the phenomenon of blindsight, such as the light scattered to the good field of vision, but eventually all alternative views were ruled out. We owe much of our current understanding of blindsight to early experiments on monkeys. One monkey in particular, named Helen, was the original blindsight subject. Her primary visual cortex was completely removed. This procedure had the expected results that Helen became blind as indicated by the typical test results for blindness. However, under certain specific situations, Helen exhibited sighted behavior. Her pupils would dilate and she would blink at stimuli that threatened her eyes. Also, under certain experimental conditions, she could detect a variety of visual stimuli, such as the presence and location of objects, as well as shapes, patterns, orientation, motion, and color. In many cases, she was able to navigate her environment and interact with objects as if she was sighted. She could not consciously see, as seen before in Dr. Larry's patient, but she was perceiving her own environment. There are actually two different types of blindsight. In type 1, a subject has no awareness whatsoever of stimulus, but are able to predict specific aspects of a stimulus. For instance, they might be able to tell you the color of an object or reach out to its location. While they won't be accurate 100% of the time, in a forced response trial, they score statistically much better than they would possibly through chance alone. In type 2, the patient has some awareness of the movement or the fact that something is near them, but still cannot visually perceive it. Their eyes may even track movement of objects, as they normally would, but they would not be able to describe it. Remember back in class, we met this guy. His name is Graham, and he has blindsight. When he was sat in front of a computer with a stimulus only on his bad side, he was able to correctly distinguish directions of objects moving on the screen. This is a very common test or experiment for blindsight. Typically, an object or shape, like a square or an arrow, appears on the screen briefly and moves quickly in a particular direction. The patient, though consciously unaware of the correct direction, must guess at the answer. Graham was able to identify the directions miraculously even though he could not see them. Arrows, much like these, are examples of something that may be seen on the screen. For reliability, Graham reassures us that he cannot see by saying,
"It's very easy for me to say to you, oh, I saw that move up, Colin. And as soon as I say that, you're going to say, ah, he can see. No, I can't."
Because the difficulty and resistance that a patient might have in being asked to discriminate something they cannot see, other methods of assessing residual function have been developed. The most quantitatively sensitive method depends upon changes in the diameter of the pupil, which constricts not only to the increase in light energy, but to a wide variety of stimuli without any energy change. These include sine wave gratings, movement, and color. The acuity of the blind field can be accurately measured by pupillometry. There are three theories for the explanation of blind sight. The first states that after damage to the visual cortex, or area V1, other branches of the optic nerve deliver visual information to the superior colliculus and several other areas, including parts of the cerebral cortex. These areas might control the blind sight responses, but still many people with damage to area V1 don't show blind sight or only show it in certain parts of the visual field. Another explanation to the phenomenon is that even though the majority of a person's visual cortex may be damaged, tiny islands of healthy tissue remain. These islands aren't large enough to provide conscious perception, but nevertheless enough for blind sight. The third theory has to do with the lateral genucleate nucleus. The LGN in normal people sends signals that merge the information from the eyes into a three-dimensional representation, extract divergent signal to benefit the precision optical system, and extract a focus control signal for the lenses of the eyes. The stereoscopic information is attached to the object information passed to the cerebral cortex. In blindsight patients, the information required to determine the distance to and velocity of an object in object space is determined by the LGN before the information is projected to the cerebral cortex. Blindsight has also been studied to address more cognitive questions, such as whether selective attention can influence unconscious processes. Some argue that attention and consciousness are so closely related that they may be the same thing. For instance, ignoring an item in a visual scene is an active process, but there is a continued awareness that the item still exists and can become the focus of attention on demand. But if selective attention could also affect unconscious perception in blindsight, consciousness and attention would be separable processes. In a study by Robert Kentridge, a patient's attention was drawn to a particular location in his blind field by an arrow in his seeing field pointing to a blind field location. The patient was fast to correctly guess the orientation of an unseen line when the cue pointed to the location of the line than when it pointed elsewhere. Thus, attention facilitated his response to an unconscious stimulus, ruling out the hypothesis equating attention with consciousness. The New York Times published a mind-blowing story on December 22, 2008. The man, a doctor left behind by two successive strokes, refused to take part in the experiment. He said he could not see anything and had no interest in navigating an obstacle course, a cluttered hallway, for the benefit of science. Why bother? When he finally tried it, though, something remarkable happened. He zigzagged down the hall, sidestepping a garbage can, a tripod, a stack of paper, and several boxes as if he could see everything clearly. A researcher shadowed him in case he stumbled. Beatrice de Gelder, a neuroscientist at Harvard and Tilburg University in the Netherlands, said, "You just had to see it to believe it." Blindsight means that though a person is perceptually blind, they can in fact respond to certain stimuli. Blindsight is an incredibly fascinating but also very traumatic phenomenon that outlines the complexity of the human brain and in particular the intricate nature of the link between our conscious and unconscious mind. Almost thought we